Eu começo. Posso começar? Depois eu passo para você. Bom dia a todos. Eu gostaria de... Vamos falar em português? Português. Eu gostaria de, em nome da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, primeiro explicar que o presidente Carlos Ivan pediu-me ontem mesmo por telefone da Europa, onde ele se encontra participando de um seminário, que dissesse do seu desejo de ver essa conferência que vai tratar de assuntos de grande relevância para o Brasil, em particular, que infelizmente ele não pôde estar presente porque está atendendo ou participando de um seminário na Áustria. De forma que, em nome do Carlos Ivan e da direção da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, eu queria começar fazendo uma referência ao apoio da Vale para a concretização desse seminário que se desenvolverá hoje e amanhã. A presença do presidente da Vale hoje aqui é a demonstração mais clara do interesse dessa grande companhia em ver debatidos e discutidos assuntos de grande relevância, não apenas para a sua companhia, mas para o Brasil também. Eu faria uma breve referência aos professores Roberto Castelo Branco, da Vale, e que também integrou durante muito tempo o corpo de professores da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, e o professor João Victor Isler, que são, na verdade, aqueles dois que formaram o comitê que organizou esse seminário de hoje e de amanhã. Acho que devo também fazer uma referência aos denominados keynote speakers, que vieram para apresentar os seus papers, os seus estudos, participar dos debates com a audiência, e são eles de vários países. Eu menciono os Estados Unidos, a Inglaterra, a França, o Chile, e creio que são esses os países que têm representantes brasileiros aqui, evidentemente também os nossos professores da Fundação e da Universidade Católica do Rio de Janeiro. Eu não vou me alongar, apenas, em poucas palavras, lembrar da importância que as commodities tiveram, têm e terão na história econômica brasileira. Não preciso lembrar aos brasileiros que um dos nossos mais importantes estados se chama Minas Gerais. Não por outra razão, a não ser a sua abundância de minerais valiosos. Durante a época colonial, foi a prata, o ouro, o café que movimentaram a economia brasileira. E, de forma mais recente, nos anos 50, um daqueles que nós chamaríamos de founding fathers da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, o professor Eugênio Goudin, de um lado, e o industrialista Roberto Simons, em São Paulo, travaram um grande debate sobre política econômica, se ela deveria privilegiar o agrobusiness ou se ela devia privilegiar a industrialização, que é um debate que está presente ainda hoje no Brasil. É um debate de grande importância. Na década de 50, nós estamos falando em algo que ocorreu há quase 70 anos atrás, ou perto de 60 e poucos anos atrás, mas que está presente nos dias de hoje. Também não se pode esquecer, entre as commodities importantes, um papel, ora negativo, ora positivo, que o petróleo tem tido na vida da economia brasileira. Na década de 70 e 80, o Brasil passou por uma grande crise cambial, resultado das abruptas elevações de preço de petróleo. De maneira que as commodities acompanham a vida econômica brasileira, e por isso esse seminário, ao discutir os seus efeitos, os seus efeitos sobre a economia brasileira e sobre a economia mundial, serão certamente muito importantes e bem-vindos. Então, eu gostaria de finalmente registrar a presença do professor Robert Engel, que é o Prêmio Nobel de 2003, e, mencionando o seu nome, cumprimento os demais professores e acadêmicos que vão participar dessa discussão. Então, a Fundação Getúlio Vargas se sente muito honrada com a presença de todos os senhores, pela audiência aqui presente, pelo apoio da Companhia Vale para esse evento e para outros eventos que certamente serão ainda feitos em conjunto com a Fundação Getúlio Vargas, e dou como inaugurada essa sessão, passando a palavra ao presidente da Vale, doutor Murilo.
Bom dia a todos. Muito obrigado, Sérgio, pela apresentação. Queria saudar a todos vocês, ao Roberto, que sempre traz uma motivação muito grande para a gente participar desses eventos com a academia. E, para mim, é uma emoção muito grande voltar a essa casa. Eu estudei na Fundação de São Paulo, depois eu complementei meus estudos aqui no Rio de Janeiro, nessa mesma fundação. Eu já vim com um terno hoje azul marinho, para me lembrar do inesquecível professor Mário Henrique. Pena que não tenha giz, porque ele, quando terminava, sempre passava a mão de giz sobre o terno azul marinho. Então, é uma homenagem que eu também faço a ele, nosso inesquecível professor. Então, eu queria dizer a vocês que nós, especialmente nesse momento de grande incerteza mundial, né, eu acho que é uma incerteza política e uma incerteza econômica, é muito oportuno a gente ter esse encontro, esse debate, estabelecendo o contraditório. A situação política mundial é uma situação muito difícil, né? Eu acho que as pessoas se atêm muito ao aspecto econômico, mas ainda esses dias eu estava vendo nos jornais a pesquisa americana do próximo pleito eleitoral, exatamente empatado, e quando os Estados Unidos está precisando de algum tipo de definição, o pior resultado que você pode ter, na minha visão, sobre o futuro do país líder, é você ainda continuar com uma sociedade profundamente dividida. Assim como acontece com a Europa, com seus 17 parlamentos, e com a sua incapacidade demonstrada até agora de resolver os seus problemas de uma forma, porque sempre tem alguém que acha que está ganhando e alguém acha que está perdendo. Então, nós estamos num momento político muito difícil, e isso realmente traz conturbação ao endereçamento das questões econômicas. E, para minha surpresa, eu vejo, para os meus prezados analistas, para a imprensa, de modo geral, o destaque que ela dá a uma China que continua crescendo. Ela está crescendo em números diferentes, né? Nós estamos crescendo aí numa base de 10,5% durante os últimos 8 anos, e se fala agora de um crescimento de 7% a 8%, realmente sobre uma base muito maior, quando, na minha opinião, a gente tem que se preocupar muito com o aspecto político. Ele não pode estar desassociado da situação econômica que se vive. A Vale é uma empresa com grande inserção no mundo. Nós estamos hoje com 38, trabalhamos em 38 diferentes países. Inclusive, eu não sei se eu sou piloto de avião ou presidente da empresa, né? De tanto que nós temos que viajar. Eu percebo, eu gostaria de dar aqui a minha opinião muito preliminar e muito curta sobre o cenário que nós estamos vendo na Ásia. Eu acho que a China estava totalmente preparada para começar a sair de um modelo voltado ao investimento para um modelo de consumo, quando nós tivemos os eventos de 2008 e 2009. Já estava a caminho quando aconteceu aquilo. Imediatamente o governo tomou medidas de grande amplitude, que foram capazes não só de recuperar a economia chinesa de um declínio importante, mas também, vamos de uma certa forma, ajudar profundamente, fortemente a economia americana e europeia. O que nós percebemos hoje é que, primeiro, as autoridades japonesas tem algum arrependimento do tamanho da ajuda que foi dado e da forma que foi dado, porque uma parte desse investimento que foi realizado provavelmente não voltará. Talvez 35%, 30%, 40% desse investimento não voltará. Só para lembrar vocês se lembram que esse estímulo aconteceu de uma forma muito descentralizada, vamos dizer assim, nos municípios, e isso levou a que muitos não fossem muito cuidadosos na alocação do investimento, e a realidade é que as autoridades hoje não têm muita disposição para retornar com aquele mesmo modelo e vendo, inclusive, as repercussões fiscais que podem acontecer. Mas eles estão focados na retomar aquela mudança do investimento para o consumo. Talvez um evento inesperado que esteja acontecendo é que certamente você não abandonaria o investimento, seria uma mudança gradual, sistemática, gradual, né? O que está acontecendo é que a parte do investimento privado ela não está acontecendo na China conforme poderia se esperar. O investimento privado está muito assustado com as reduções de margem, as margens se contraíram muito, e isso está levando a uma expectativa de crescimento ligeiramente abaixo daquilo que poderia se esperar. Eu sempre trabalhei no ano com algum crescimento chinês na base de 8%, 8,5%, mais para 8,5%, mas se o investimento privado não corresponder e o governo não ajudar de alguma forma no investimento público, nós podemos realmente ficar numa base de 7%, 7,5%. Então, eu acho que é um movimento de transição. Eu manifesto minha confiança, minha certeza da determinação das autoridades, e especialmente do povo chinês, de ocupar o lugar que eles acreditam que eles merecem na economia mundial. Só para lembrar uma relação injusta, né, porque lá eles têm 2/3 da população na Ásia e 1/3 no nosso lado, e na riqueza era exatamente o contrário, 2/3 do nosso lado e 1/3 para lá. Então, há uma migração de riqueza, e eles estão determinados a absorver essa parte da economia mundial, e eu acredito que vão absorver, e como tal, como é um grande contingente populacional, no decorrer do tempo, esse grande contingente vai continuar absorvendo uma quantidade muito grande de commodities. É um processo inexorável. Qualquer análise que a gente pode fazer será feita de curto prazo. Você falar, mas porque daqui 3 meses o cobre não está indo desse jeito, a soja não está, o minério de ferro não está, mas você pode ter certeza que o processo de crescimento da Ásia é inexorável. E lembrando a vocês que quando eu estou falando de Ásia, eu não estou limitado à China, nem estou falando de Índia. Um país que eu tenho grande contato, por exemplo, que é a Indonésia, é um país de 250 milhões de pessoas, que tem, desde aquela famosa crise do final dos anos 90, crescido sustentadamente acima de 5%. Então, eu costumo dizer que nós temos um partido muito grande, o PCC, que é o Partido dos Contra a China, mas esse partido vai perder de novo. Vai perder de novo. Agora, o processo não é uma reta, né? As coisas, elas fazem seus ajustes. Para quem frequenta a Ásia com a intensidade que eu frequento, na década de 80, eu ia lá muito a Japão e Coreia, e de 90 e 2000, praticamente a cada 3 meses eu estou na China. Então, eu acompanho esse processo e você pode ver a dimensão. Então, quem estiver apostando contra, vai fazer uma aposta equivocada. Agora, que existem transtornos, existem solavancos no meio desse caminho, realmente existem. E não seria razoável imaginar que é uma coisa, uma ciência absolutamente que não sofre influência dos diversos acontecimentos que nós temos no mundo. Esse acontecimento da Europa é um acontecimento de grande dimensão. Eu vejo no nosso contato com as empresas, com pessoas do meio acadêmico, que eu tenho grande respeito. Eu nunca me afastei da academia, eu tenho, nas entrevistas que eu dou, recentemente eu estou vendo a minha querida Vera Durão aqui, eu falei, ela me perguntou sobre um evento que vai acontecer agora do Valor, e eu disse, olha, para mim continua sendo estudar e formar time. Né? Você tem que estudar, estudar e estudar. Então, a leitura é a minha companheira de todos os dias, com mais ou menos intensidade, e esse contato com a academia. E nessas discussões que nós temos, nós muitas vezes podemos ficar contaminados por esse curto prazo. Felizmente, na empresa que eu trabalho, as pessoas que me antecederam, e eu quero especialmente lembrar aquelas pessoas que se envolveram no final da década de 70, 80, que foram capazes de construir Carajás, elas não se preocuparam com o viés de curto prazo. Senão Carajás não estaria oferecendo o melhor minério do mundo, na quantidade que é oferecida, na eficiência que é oferecida, né? Então, você não pode ter essa visão. Eu acredito, nós estamos partindo para um evento muito poderoso. Naquela ocasião era para fazer Carajás com 30 milhões de toneladas. Carajás foi crescendo. O ano passado nós produzimos 109 milhões. E agora, num salto, nós queremos ir para 230 milhões. É um salto muito importante, é um salto que vai exigir uma infraestrutura mais dispendiosa do que a própria mina, né? Nós vamos gastar superior a 40 bilhões de reais, mas nós vamos ter certeza que nós vamos oferecer um minério que traz muito mais produtividade, que não tem contaminantes e que vai dar a sustentação para esse crescimento, para esses 2/3 da população que sempre ficou fora desse crescimento mais forte que acontecia nos Estados Unidos e na Europa. Então, a nossa mensagem é uma mensagem de confiança, é uma mensagem de quem acredita que nós vamos implantar os projetos que nós temos que implantar dentro da prioridade, e essa palavra da minha gestão, a palavra prioridade, né? Dentro de uma disciplina na alocação de capital muito forte, dentro de uma disciplina que signifique que nós sabemos muito bem o que significa estabelecer uma prioridade, e retomando o viés de crescimento que sempre foi uma marca da Vale e que por diversas razões, desde 2006, nós não fomos capazes de crescer no minério de ferro, no cobre, no níquel. E eu vejo aí o Marcos, o Felipe, que nos seus relatórios questionam muito por que a Vale não cresceu nos últimos anos, por que houve, onde que estava a alocação de capital. E como a nossa forma de gestão é muito simples, vocês vão ver numa simples folha de papel, não mais em um book, né, aonde que estarão esses recursos e aonde eles estarão alocados e o retorno que nós estamos pretendendo obter para a empresa. Então, é essa a minha mensagem, é uma mensagem de confiança, sabendo que nós temos um desafio político contundente, fortíssimo, e que, no entanto, com a determinação, especialmente desses países que foram convidados a entrar na festa, que foram convidados a ter uma participação muito mais expressiva na economia mundial, as empresas brasileiras serão capazes de dar uma resposta contundente e especialmente a Vale com competência. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, doutor Sérgio, por passar a palavra para mim. Eu estou aqui representando o professor Rubens Cisne, diretor da EPGE, que não pôde vir. Então, eu vou falar bem pouquinho sobre esse ângulo. Em primeiro lugar, eu queria agradecer a Vale, porque tem financiado vários dos projetos da EPGE, também a presidência da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, que é representada por doutor Sérgio Quintela, que sempre tem apoiado essas iniciativas da EPGE. A EPGE, a Escola de Pós-Graduação de Economia, em certo sentido, é a instituição líder em pesquisa em ciência econômica da América Latina, e isso aí nos tem proporcionado, é bom enfatizar isso, além de uma melhor possível educação dos nossos alunos de mestrado, mestrado profissionalizante, doutorado, graduação, em pesquisa econômica, eles vão ensinar posteriormente. Nós temos também feito várias iniciativas como essa de aliar a ciência à econômica no seu mais estado atual. Por exemplo, nessa reunião aqui está o professor Engel e Eliette, ou vários outros cientistas líderes, e aplicando alguma área de conhecimento mais específico, útil para a sociedade. Só para lembrar algumas das reuniões que nós fizemos recentemente, o próprio João Vitor Isla, que é o principal organizador, junto com Roberto Castelo Branco, desse evento, já organizou um sobre a China, né? Nós organizamos já sobre educação infantil, nós organizamos sobre macroeconomia, sobre finanças, e, enfim, temos feito uma série de reuniões tentando aproximar a academia, a ciência econômica e em aplicações importantes, como essa aqui que nós estamos estudando, a questão da commodities. Eu não vou me delongar mais, queria agradecer a todos. Muito obrigado.
Eu vou passar, então, o comando da mesa para o doutor Roberto Castelo Branco e para o João Vitor, para que eles, então, iniciem o processo de convite aos senhores palestrantes, dando, portanto, a palavra inicialmente ao doutor Roberto Castelo Branco. Você agora comanda, senta aqui. E eu vou sentar.
Agora nós vamos começar os trabalhos. Eu vou falar um pouco em inglês. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank you for all the speakers that came from different places in the world, from different nationalities. We have Americans, French, Indians, Chileans, and I believe that this conference will contribute to deepen the knowledge about the commodity world, to remove some bias against commodities, and to reinforce in the Brazilian society that commodities are a source of economic growth. And in particularly, I would like to thank the great partnership with Professor Isla, who is not only a great econometrician, but someone with a very good managerial talent. João.
Thank you. Well, I guess if my managerial talents were better, we'll be on time, but in any case. So we should start right away. So I invite Rob Engel and Yet Geman to present the papers. The idea is that presentations should last for 45 minutes to 50 at most, and then we open up for questions, and that is a rule for everybody. And I guess we're going to advance a little bit on the coffee break to keep time on track. Please.
Well, good morning. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you today. I want to thank very much Vale and Fundación Getulio Vargas for sponsoring and putting on this conference, particularly Mr. Ferreira and Mr. Quintela from this morning, and Professor Rajo y Isler and Roberto Branco for all the work they have done in promoting and putting together this conference. I'm going to talk today about volatility, the volatility of commodity prices, and it's one of the famous characteristics of commodities that they're extremely volatile and difficult to forecast. And one of the things we know is that in financial markets, even though it may be difficult to predict the direction that prices are likely to move, it's not so difficult to predict their volatility. And so I want to talk about what are the prospects, what do we think the volatility looks like for financial products like commodities. And first of all, the question is, why are we interested in the volatility of financial assets in general? It's usually because we're interested in the risk. There is risk that's faced by investors who buy commodities or buy other financial products. And often these risks are short-run risks, risks that are faced on a daily or monthly basis as portfolios are changed over time, maybe even on a second-by-second basis today. We've moved to a very high-frequency approach in many cases to financial transactions. But we also have investors with long horizons, and this is particularly true in the supply where firms have to make long-run decisions that have to do with what you think the future prices and volatilities are likely to be. And so I'm going to focus on not just short-run, but long-run volatility of commodities prices, as this is a key decision variable for many kinds of investment decisions. What is the difference between long-run risk and short-run risk then? There is one additional component to risk that we need to focus on, which is in the long run, there is the risk that the risk will change. That even though volatility might be low today, there is a risk that it will go up, and you have to take that into account when you're thinking about long-run decision-making. So we've seen enormous changes in commodities markets over the last few decades, I think. I'm more of an external view of this than many of you, but commodities were originally traded between producers and end users with really very little financial by the rest of the financial world. Today, it's not that way at all, that commodities are traded as part of portfolios held throughout the world, and so the financial sector is much more involved in the trading of commodities than it ever used to be. And I think we'll see that effect as we look at some of the data. So, as I say, I'm going to try to come up with measures of what we think relatively long-run volatilities might look like for the commodity sector. I'm going to use the GSCI database. It was originally constructed by Goldman Sachs and is now managed by Standard & Poor's. They have an approximation to spot prices, which they have for a wide range of commodities and broader indices. These are typically short-end maturity futures contracts, the nearest to deliver, and it's designed so that these indices are investable, and consequently they can be treated as financial prices, and I will use them that way. So if you look sort of broadly from 2000 to, well, a couple of weeks ago, first of all, I want to show you sort of on an annualized basis what the volatility of these commodities really look like. I'm going to look at 22 different commodities, which are roughly divided into agricultural, industrial, and energy products. And I want to compare them with the volatilities of other kinds of assets that we typically look at. So let me show you, first of all, how do we measure volatility? We tend to measure it on an annualized basis, and it's basically the standard deviation that you would expect to hold an asset for a year if it's really constant. We measure at a higher frequency basis, but we calculate the lower frequency, we implicitly calculate the low frequency standard deviation. So, for example, here is just some sample volatilities of assets that maybe we know well. If you look, for example, at, I guess it's not, yeah, I'm not sure how much you're going to be able to see, but IBM is a benchmark we all know about. It had a volatility of about 40% over a 6-year period that I'm just taking for reference, not particularly high, not particularly low. If you look at General Electric, it's a little bit less. Citigroup, it's about the same. McDonald's, maybe 33%. Walmart, 35%. And these are all large cap stocks, and this gives you an idea what sort of volatilities we expect from large cap stocks. If you look instead at the S&P as a whole, the Standard & Poor's 500, it's a broad-based index, it has a lower volatility than any of these large cap components, and that's exactly why we think of investing in a broad index as diversifying, because it reduces the volatility. If you look instead at small cap stocks, and this is just some that are picked sort of randomly, Penn, Virginia, Norfolk Southern, Airgas, GTS, Duratec, and Meteorologic Instruments, you see volatilities that range from 30% up to 70%. And generally speaking, small cap stocks can have much higher volatilities than large cap stocks. What about other asset classes? For example, how about short-term interest rates? I don't know whether you can see, but there's a little green thing there. It's about 1% for the volatility of short-term treasury bills. If you use longer-term treasury bills, it might be 5%, or for 20 years, it's 10%. So bonds typically have much lower volatilities than stocks. And finally, if you look at currencies on here, 10% for the, what's the Australian dollar, the Canadian dollar is half of that, the yen is about 10%, and the pound is a little bit less. So this gives you sort of a general idea what sort of numbers we're talking about. Volatilities for financial assets tell you how variable they're likely to be, and it varies tremendously over asset classes. So what about commodities? Well, here's what you get for these 22 commodities. You see volatilities that range from a low of, for live cattle, of about 15%, and a high, in this case of natural gas, of about a little over 50%. But the range is kind of in the middle, and it's a lot like large cap stocks. These are not such high volatilities as you would expect for speculative, low-priced, small-cap stocks. They're somewhere in between. Looks dangerous. Thank you. We're going to spend a little extra effort on three of these, which are aluminum, copper, and nickel. And as you can see, they sort of range from a little over 20%, 30%, and 40%. Now, these are historical numbers. These are averages over a decade. But what sort of a risk measure do we want to talk about when we talk about long-run volatility? Well, in risk management, one of the common measures is value at risk, or VAR. And the 1% VAR is a measure which is designed to answer the following question. What's an estimate of the case which is worse than whatever happens 99 times out of 100? Only one time out of 100 will the outcome be worse than the VAR. So we'd like to know what these tail probabilities really look like, the probability of events that are this extreme. And from the numbers that I just showed you, we can come up with a very crude estimate of what these VARs look like, even at a one-year horizon. If we think that volatility is really constant and that it's normally distributed, there's a simple formula that tells you what the 1% point would be looking forward a whole year. Usually we calculate VAR looking ahead one day, but we're going to look at it looking forward 1 year because we're interested in trying to measure long-run risk. That is, if 1 year ahead there is some possibility of gains, some possibility of losses, and this is the 1% point, what is that? How far is that from where we are today? And if you're a fish, you know, is 1% the right number? Here comes the shark. You know, you can't get it to zero, but anyway, that's just to wake you up if you're asleep. Okay, so what does this 1% VAR look like? Well, for aluminum, it looks like, looking a year ahead, there is a 1% chance it'll go down by 40%. I don't know. Is that right? This is done in a very crude, simple way, but it gives you the idea. For copper, it looks like we could have a 50% decline a year from today. But that's only one time out of 100. It would be that bad. For nickel, it's even higher. It's 60%. Well, you might ask, what was it over this last decade? Of course, we don't have very many 10-year periods. Maybe 10 if they're not overlapping. But I'm going to show you of all the 1-year periods, starting on every day over the last 10 years, what's the 1% quantile? And you see the 1% quantile is the yellow one. That's the realized volatility over this decade. And the red is the one that I already showed you. And as you can see, there's not that dramatic a difference at this point. You see, what did I say? Natural gas was the highest, but you can see that that's pretty close to what actually the 1% quantile was. Here, for aluminum, it was a little bigger. For copper, it was a little bigger. For nickel, where are we? A little bigger, but basically, we have very little confidence in what you can measure over 10 years for extreme outcomes. And what I'm doing this so that you'll get an idea what the question is I want to ask, and then I'm going to try to ask it a little more sophisticated way. Okay? So what is the 1% point of the outcome of commodity prices that you can expect a year from today? Well, like most financial assets, commodity prices change all the time. They're not constant over a year like I assumed just a minute ago. They're also not normally distributed as I assumed a minute ago. So I'm going to show you, first of all, some results that are on this website called VLab, which stands for Volatility Laboratory. And it's a website that we put up at the Volatility Institute that estimates and updates volatility forecasts every day for several thousand assets. It includes the GSCI assets, although at the moment it's only in a development version. So I'm going to show you a couple of things that are from the development version, but it will soon be part of the regular website. So here's kind of what you see. And here is a picture of the price of copper in green. That's the level of copper prices from, this is 5 years that are being shown here, from January of 2008 through the financial crisis, big rise, and then the decline we've seen over the last year or so. The blue curve is the change from one day to the next. And volatility is a way of measuring what's the amplitude of this change. And you can see it's much higher here than it is in here. And on the top is what the Garch models show this volatility to be. And the copper is in red. We've got nickel in blue and aluminum in green. And included on this is the VIX, which is what the options market volatility is for stocks in the U.S. And what you see, of course, is they all went up during the financial crisis, except for this one, the green one, which is aluminum. The volatility of aluminum did not go up very much during the financial crisis. It's interesting, but nickel and copper went up a lot. They have all come down. They went up again in the spring of 2010 when we first became aware that there was a sovereign credit crisis in Europe, and Greece was threatening to leave the European Union. And then last summer, they went up again when we saw the U.S. debt ceiling debacle. I don't know whether I should use that word or some other word about how terribly our politicians handled what is a routine economic event. And at the same time, Europe was having its next round of struggles, but then they've been coming down again. And actually, one of the things about this graph, which makes my talk possibly less dramatic than it otherwise would be, is that we kind of end up in a pretty medium range. The volatilities today are not nearly as extreme as some of these other periods. The volatilities are ranging from, for aluminum, a little under 20%, and for Nickel, a little over 30%. So these are kind of like what the long-run averages were that I already showed you. So this is what you get, and you can see this every day. You'll get a forecast every day, and actually a forecast a year ahead every day of what the volatility is. If you look at precious metals, gold, silver, and platinum, you see something which is pretty similar. This is gold plotted at the bottom, and what you see is there hasn't been much of a decline in gold prices compared to what there are in the other metals. And you can see that the volatility of silver in blue is much higher than the volatility of the other precious metals. Gold is the red one, which you can't see very well, but that's about 20% here, whereas silver is more like 30%, and silver went up dramatically in this whole period in 11 to 12. There are some new approaches to estimating volatility, and I just thought I would give you one slide on them. These are now called, these are generalized autoregressive score models, which becomes shortened to GAS, like gasoline. So these GAS models are proposed by Creel, Koopman, and Lucas, use the error distributions, fat-tailed error distributions, to derive the functional form of a Garch model. These are alternatives to Garch, or maybe generalizations of Garch-style models. If you know what the Garch model looks like, it says that the conditional variance depends on the squared return yesterday and the conditional variance yesterday. In this case, it depends on something which has the squared return here and in the denominator. So when squared returns are really big, the numerator and the denominator tend to kind of cancel each other out, so you don't get such a big effect on volatilities. So it's supposedly going to give you a better estimate of the volatility in response to extreme moves. So here again from VLab is a plot where the red curve is the GAS model using the student T distribution, and the blue is the one that we've been looking at, which is an asymmetric style Garch model. And in fact, I don't really think there's much difference. In fact, one of the things I think we've probably learned is that most of these volatility models are very similar to each other. They have very similar predictions. There is maybe small differences on timing and so forth, but as a whole, you get similar answers for any of these models. And so that's, in a way, reassuring that it's not that important that you know the latest model before you do this. So what is the forecast from the future? Well, from a Garch model, we can forecast 1 day ahead, and we can calculate the 1 day ahead value at risk. And this is used by financial industry all the time. I mean, this is the basic market risk tool that's used in finance. But what we're saying we are interested in is a long-run value at risk. What is the 1 year ahead value at risk? How do you do that with the Garch model? We know what the volatility is today. We might predict what the volatility is going to be a year from now, but that doesn't tell us what the tails are going to look like a year from now. So how do you do that? Well, what we're going to do is calculate this fact. And so here's why it's important. Here's the volatility that I've shown you before, which is the average over the decade. And the green one is the last volatility. And so what you see is for some of these products, the volatility at the end of the sample is higher than the average, and for some, it's lower than the average. So when we do our calculation of the risk, we want to use the most recent estimate, not just a long-run average. So how are we going to do it? What we're going to do is we're going to try to get a forward-looking measure of what this 1% point is a year ahead. What we're going to calculate is a long-run risk measure, and this is also done in VLab. So what we're going to do is simulate, using the Garch model, starting at the last day, 10,000 scenarios of what could possibly happen. It's like these 10,000 fish in the sea. And then we're going to look at the 1% point a year from now and see what that looks like. So does this incorporate the risk that the risk will change? And the answer is yes. That's exactly what a Garch model does, is it tells you how fast the risk can change, how fast it does change. And when we look at the worst case outcomes, these are the ones where the risk has changed the most. So we do this now every day. So if we look today, or I guess this is probably a week or two ago, it's about 50% down is what we would expect for copper, starting with the most recent information, looking ahead a year. But if we did it back in January, when volatility was higher, we'd have said the worst case outcome would be 70% down. And so this gives you a picture of what this 1 year ahead 1% point looks like over time. And the bottom picture is the same as what you've seen before. So this is what our forecast would be for copper. Here's what it looks like for nickel. It's a little bit more, 55% down. Here's what it looks like for aluminum, a little bit less. Silver, about 50%, and you can see that was down to 80% in the worst part of I guess last summer, really. Gold, not so volatile, but it's still got volatility to it. Okay. So I think one of the things that these numbers could be useful for is doing stress tests. I don't know whether you do stress tests in the commodities business, but in financial institutions, everybody wants to generate scenarios that they look at to see what would happen under this scenario. But the problem is you don't know whether the scenario has any possibility of occurring or not. This is a scenario that has a probability of 1% of happening, and you can say, what happens to our company if this event, which has one probability of 100 of happening, actually occurs? And that's an interesting question to ask. If it's the end of the company, you probably say that's more risk than I want to take. But if it means you lose, $1 million or so, that's probably a risk you're willing to take. So, that's all right. The thing that I want to get to now says, I've been looking at these products one at a time, but really this is a global economy, and the real risk, the real long-run future risk, is the risk to the global economy, and how does that spill over to commodity prices? So what is the relationship between the global macroeconomy and these commodity prices? We are worried in the U.S. about the macroeconomy going forward, especially if Europe tends to blow up. China is worried about the macroeconomy in case Europe blows up. We're also worried if the U.S. doesn't solve its domestic problems with the fiscal cliff and the Tea Party and all these kinds of things. Brazil, I'm sure, is worried about Europe and the U.S. So when we talk about these long-run risks, we want to include those kinds of risks as part of the analysis that we look at. So I want to ask now a related but slightly different question. I want to ask, what do we think would happen to commodity prices if we have another financial crisis like the last one? Okay? That's a question we'd probably all like to know the answer to. We can put our own probabilities on the financial crisis, but we'd like to know what do we expect to happen in this case. What is the consequence of a big global bear market? Bear crossing. Okay. Well, what we're going to calculate is something we call the marginal expected shortfall. We want to ask, for a commodity price like Y, what will it expect it to be if X, which is something like a global stock market price, falls below some value that we're concerned about? We can calculate this on a daily basis, or we can calculate it on a long-run basis where we ask the cumulated value of the changes in the commodity price in response to the cumulated values of the global equity price. And we're going to be interested in answering the question, if we think that the global stock market falls by 40% over the next year, what do we think is going to happen to the to commodity prices? Okay? Question is not hard to say. The question is not hard to understand. What is hard is to figure out the answer. So I'm going to give you some first steps on this answer, but really what I'm going to show you is not as sophisticated as probably you would want to do going forward. So a standard way to think about this is to do a regression. You regress the commodity return on the global stock market return, you get a beta, and this beta is the thing that's really going to tell you how to translate stock market returns into commodity market returns. But the problem with this regression is that it assumes that the betas are really constant. But we've talked about the evolution of this market and how it's changed. And I think we want to take into account the possibility that the betas are not really constant. And how do we do that? In fact, this is a problem motivated by the topic of this discussion, but it comes up everywhere. It comes up in asset prices, it comes up in pricing, it comes up in style measures, also portfolio problem. It comes up everywhere. Is beta really constant? And as an econometrician, I get sort of asked, well, what do we do about that? And so, actually, I thought I had another slide there. No, guess not. Yikes. So I'm going to show you a method which is called dynamic conditional beta. So this is like a dynamic beta, and what we want to know is, conditional on everything we know up till now, what do we think the beta is in the future? It's been used to do a lot of different things, and just a second, let me look at the next slide, see whether I've, yeah, okay. So it's the solution that I think is most useful in the financial context to this problem. But what are the alternative solutions that we have for this model? Well, the most common thing to do is to do a rolling regression, where you pick a window and you estimate your beta over this window and you move it over time. But there is sort of some logical contradictions in doing that, and there is this enormously complex problem of how big a window should you use. If you pick a big window, beta hardly moves at all. If you pick a small window, beta jumps all over the place. So what's the right way to do that? And there seems no statistical measure associated with that that helps you know whether you've got the right window or the wrong window. So what I'm going to tell you about is actually a way of thinking about that rolling window problem. But another thing we could do would be to parameterize the model with the betas changing by interacting the variables with time trends or other observables. Or we could do something sophisticated using the Kalman filter and time-varying parameter models. Or we could have models where the betas are constant over time until there's a structural break, and then the regime switches. So econometrics has a variety of suggestions, but each of these specifies an additional economic structure that we'd have to think about. That's why we tend to use rolling regressions, because we don't have to think about it. But it's not that attractive solution. So what is the dynamic conditional beta model that I'm thinking about?